And yeah, well, thanks for joining us. I'm hoping that people get the message from our teams um, that we are on Zoom. I'm going to text them again. Um, yeah, but anyway, so we've got about, well, a few people here. I see there's probably 10 people on our Teams call. We usually meet via Teams, and I just gave everybody a link and said we'll meet via Zoom. Zoom is just as good as Teams.
Okay, guys, check chat. He said to join Zoom.
Okay.
Well, how many people do you have ordinarily? This is a whole
Uh,
class.
we have 21 people in the class. So yeah, let me just get on there. Hey, everybody, join Zoom if you can. That's where we are. All right. I'm on Teams and Zoom at the same time. So, well, Howard, again, thanks for taking the time to join us. As you may know, our assigned readings for this week were two chapters from our forthcoming book. One was on the use of testing in K-12 education. I think that was chapter 4 or 5, something like that. And then our chapter on value-added modeling, which you wrote 99.9% or more of that. So a lot of our students are either current teachers or former teachers or have been in the K-12 education system. A few have not, but I think it's a relevant discussion for everyone. And we'll just start off since you're joining us the first part or whatever. We'll just jump off with some questions. And let me start with what got you interested in value added modeling? Did you had a friend, colleague, or something that did a report, right? Somebody from the Denver area was the first one to do that with the Los Angeles school district.
No. Evaluated modeling is one of those ideas that only makes sense if you say it fast. If you say it a little slower, you begin to realize how silly it was. The thing you're referring to is my cousin Kathy, who's a statistician at Colorado. She responded to something that happened in the Los Angeles Times, and that was a study in which uh, they showed. I want to get this right. They showed that that fourth grade students that had teachers with high value added scores did better in fifth grade than students in fourth grade who had teachers with low value added scores. And that was being used as a measure of the validity of using value added scores. What my cousin did is she showed that students uh, who did well in fifth grade had teachers with higher value added scores in sixth grade. So unless time goes backwards, something's confusing. So the obvious answer is that teachers who have good students get high value added scores. And that's all it is. It was going the other way. But I think what had happened is I was doing some work with New Jersey Education Association, Teachers Union, and I'm a big fan of unions in general and teachers unions in particular. I think that um, that people try to get to heaven in many different ways, but teachers can get to heaven through uh, doing the ordinary work of their day. Uh, there's a Talmudic midrash uh, by Rabban. What was his name? Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Talmud is a book of discussions in which laws are laid out, and then people discuss them, and it goes on forever. Anyway, this one was if you're in your garden planting a plant, and someone comes to you and says the Messiah has come, finish planting the plants and then go out and greet him. And what that is taken to mean is that the path to heaven is best served by doing what you do. And if you're a teacher, you can get to heaven by teaching. If you make a living by selling companies to one another, well, then you have to do other things. And so I was, as I say, I'm a big fan of teachers and teachers unions. And when I started learning about value added modeling, it seemed to me, because what it was is value added modeling is a way of measuring teachers. And they were going to take this seriously. And I thought, well, that seems like a something that ought to be done well, or not done at all. And I looked this up. So if you excuse me, let me read a quote. It says, some professors are justly renowned for their bravura performances as grand expositor on the podium, agent provocateur in the preceptorial, or kindly old mentor in the corridors. These familiar roles in the standard faculty repertoire, however, should not be mistaken for teaching, except as they are validated by the transformation of the minds and persons of the intended audience. So this notion is the way you judge a teacher is by how they have transformed the students. And, you know, that's something that sort of makes sense. But then you say, well, how can you measure that? And that's really the issue. Uh, how do you measure how a student has changed? And what value added does is they essentially give a test twice, the beginning of the year, at the end of the year. And then they make a statement. You know, Freddie's score went up 10 points when Mrs. Jones was his teacher. And that's an accurate description of what's going on. The place where value added becomes a problem is when they change that description to a causal statement. That is, Freddie gained 10 points because he had Mrs. Jones. Now, that's a big question. And you can see why it's a problem if you change it from the points to Freddie grew 5 inches when he had Mrs. Jones, as opposed to Freddie grew 5 inches because he had Mrs. Jones. Things happen, and to be able to draw a causal link is not so easy. And if you're looking at it is before and after, and then you draw a causal conclusion, you're bound to make mistakes. It just isn't. It doesn't make sense. There are all sorts of other reasons that people gain scores, and gain in performance. I remember one time my son took a French test at the beginning of the year, and then he took one at the end, and he showed a huge gain. And they said, his French teacher was great, but he didn't go to school that year because we spent it in France. So, the only way you can actually do something like this is if you randomly assign students to teachers and then see what happens. And the randomization would help clear it away. But that's too complicated because it never can work. Because randomization, even if you can do it, it changes in the middle of the year. You know, the kids leave, not randomly. They change schools. They come to the principal and say, "Look, I don't want to take Mrs. Jones. I want Mr. You know, there's also it doesn't. Or no one's tried it, and so whatever has gone on has yielded results that don't make sense. Now, it may be possible to have it make sense and to be useful, but the point is, this isn't some casual thing that's being done that has no consequence. It has profound consequences for teachers. You're weighing teachers and saying, well, and then you're doing it for schools too. We see increase from this school, from this to this in that school, and so we're going to give bonuses to that principal, and because there are profound consequences, you better be sure you get it right. And to the best of my knowledge, and you looked pretty hard, Dan, for finding situations where they did it right, and we haven't found any. It is possible to do educational research and get the right answer, but it isn't easy. You actually have to work at it. And what typically happens in most educational research is they do what are called observational studies. And an observational study is where you see results lying on the street and you pick them up. That's it. You have no control. You don't know what's going on. To be able to do causal inference, you have to have a control. You have to be able to uh, have randomization. You have to know what the condition, what the experimental condition is, the treatment, what the control condition is, and keep track of it and do it right. And it is possible. The state of Tennessee, because they cared, did a real study, and it was this Tennessee class size experiment, and what they wanted to know what class size is optimal, and so they divided kids up into different size classes randomly and kept track of how well they did. And at the end of it, and it was a big study with lots and lots of classes. And at the end of all of this, what they discovered was that smaller classes helped, but not to everybody. They helped, for example, in teaching to read for young kids, uh, but not to older kids. Older kids, smaller classes helped in math, and you can make up stories about why this is likely to be true. You know, at the beginning, you need more one-to-one help in reading, but once you know how to read, you don't need it. You don't need that sort of thing anymore. Math is a different story, and so it wasn't just do smaller classes help, but they also figured out, you know, how big small has to be, and whether adding an aide to a classroom helped. So they did this big experiment, and it lasted for a couple of years. And at the end, they had an answer, and then they did it. I mean, they actually did it, you know, it's hard to believe that in Tennessee they would do such a thing, but they did, and uh, an example for all of us that you can find things out if you care enough, and then when you do, you have a fact and you can use it. Anyway, that's my brief overall why value
Yeah.
added
Well,
something.
Howard, as you know, this value-added modeling idea, it's been around for quite a while now. And like most zombie concepts in education, there are articles that are published. There's that accompany them, rather convincing data, showing that this is a really stupid idea. And yet we see it continue to be pushed. For example, the CAPE, which is CAEP, the Council for Accreditation for Educational Programs. That replaced NCAPE, which used to accredit all teacher education programs at universities and colleges across the country. Now CAPE is in charge. They endorse value-added modeling. You would think, a national accreditation agency made up of, a lot of people with PhDs, still adopt and endorse a pretty boneheaded system. And I think it goes back to, people think like, well, it makes such good common sense. Teaching should be evaluated by, how much a student learns. The problem there is, as you know, that a teacher's effect on a student is very, very minuscule compared to so many other factors. It's sort of like going in and saying, we're going to shut down a health club if we can't show gains in terms of, body fat reduction, cholesterol reduction, muscle mass building for its clients. Teachers have very little time that they spend with students overall compared to other factors. Yet we want to run education sort of like we would a business and say, if we could just, motivate people, provide them with incentives. If those don't work, provide them with threats, fire people, get them to shape up, get rid of lazy, bad teachers, and so on. And we've been through decades and decades of failed educational reforms, and value-added modeling is just another in a long line of proposed solutions that are just, for lack of a better word, stupid. What do you make of all this? You've been around even longer than I have. You've seen even more of this than I have. Why do people have such a resistance for common sense evidence? The approach you mentioned in terms of, hey, why don't you do a decent study if you're going to do one, and then you have something worthwhile you can hold on to.
Well, I mean the perseverance of various kinds of schemes is just an indication that these are serious problems that people really care about and they want an answer. That's and they want an answer desperately. We'd all like to be able to find out, what classroom processes uh, work the best, and then have everybody use it. I mean, these are things, these are problems that people want to solve, and then when you say, okay, if you want to solve it, here's how you can try and do it. They'll say, well, that's too hard. We can't do that. So let's do the best we can within the circumstances that we operate. So, for example, uh, the states that seem to do the most poorly in various kinds of educational measures, like NAEP, uh, are also the states that spend the least on per pupil expenditure, whether it's Mississippi or Alabama or Arkansas. Uh, and you can say, well, look at Connecticut, uh, look at New Jersey, look at California, look at how much better they're doing there, and they'll say, yeah, and they're spending $20,000 per pupil expenditure, and they're paying teachers a lot of money, or a lot more than you are. Why don't you do that? And you say, we can't because we don't have that kind of money. And then we say, well, then you have to tax your inhabitants more so you can have better schools. We can't do that. That's politically impossible. So then you look for snake oil because it's cheap. And you can understand that elected officials operate in they have problems that they're supposed to solve, and one of the solutions is not asking for more resources to do it. You can't increase taxes so you can pay teachers more and build nicer schools and have smaller classes. If you cut the class size by 10%, it means you're raising the cost per pupil of 10%. I mean, it's smaller classes means you have to have more classrooms, you have to have more teachers, you have to, so on. Having better teachers, I'm sure you've looked at these things where you look at what score you need at Praxis to become a teacher, and various states have different criteria. And so I remember there was a problem in Florida where the Praxis scores that were required weren't yielding enough candidates of all sorts to be able to fulfill their needs. So they had to lower the passing score. And one teacher there was so upset with how low the score went that he gave a test. He gave a Praxis test to his fifth graders and found that 70% of them passed. And you say, well, what good is it to have a teacher that doesn't know how to do fractions, or doesn't read, or doesn't make spelling mistakes or grammatical mistakes? And he's, well, this is all we can afford to pay, and that's who we have to fill the classrooms, and on and on. You can understand. People aren't being stupid. They are operating in a world that's complicated, and they have limitations. The best you can do is point out that there are certain kinds of things that you can't do without spending some money on it. I'd like a Ferrari, but I only have $1.90.
But I think we have more than $1.90, because if you look at all the money that we spend on school accountability, other educational reform efforts, if we took all the money, think of the state contracts with testing companies like Pearson, giving students tests every few grades, trying to use those test scores to evaluate teachers, evaluate schools, principals. Think of the boneheaded educational reform efforts like Race to the Top, where low performing schools had 4 options. 2 of them involved firing the principal and replacing them. Think of the dollars it costs every time you fire a principal and have to hire a new one. Think of the dollars it costs when you fire teachers and have to hire new teachers. If you took all of the money that we spend on things that are absolutely foolish and just said, you know what, we're going to make teaching a more desirable profession. And instead of the average salary for a teacher being 50,000 across the states, we're going to bump it up to 80, which you could easily do if you took all the money from the testing and put it into teacher salaries. Think of the effects that would have. Now, we're speaking in terms of imagining, speculating what would happen. But if we bumped up average teacher salaries from 50 to 80, you would immediately get more people interested in becoming teachers. And you might get more qualified candidates. You might get some people who are going to teach 10th grade algebra who actually know algebra. You might get kids who are going to teach bilingual reading to second graders who are actually bilingual. I don't know. That's just me on my soapbox here, but it seems to me like we have more than the $1.90. We can't afford a Porsche, but we could afford a pretty damn good, reliable Toyota instead of the clunker that we have sitting in the garage.
Yeah, I don't. Well, you certainly know more about what the current figures are for the costs of testing, but my memory of it. Who was it? Guy from University of Massachusetts. Anyway, he had looked at it, and the cost of testing turned out per pupil was something like, I don't know, $18 a pupil nationwide. It wasn't a lot. The amount of time that was spent wasn't a lot. It was a tiny thing. That wasn't the place where money was being wasted. Uh, but I don't know. Maybe now it's more expensive. I don't, these numbers coming to me from my adult memory may no longer be right. Uh, but there are so many other places, and you've pointed this out. Uh, One of the places where you can improve. I mean, the our friend Rob Bly has this model, and he says that in the early part of the 20th century, the success of the Industrial Revolution uh, led people to start thinking of schools as a factory. A school is a factory, and its product are students. And if you want to improve your product, you improve the factory. You have more workers working slower. You have better trained workers. You have better lighting, better air conditioning, all of that. And so there was lots of attempts to make the schools better, whether it's No Child Left Behind or all those other things. Uh, the alternative and none of them worked very well. The alternative was to make better raw material. That is, if you just have better raw material going in, you get better results coming out, and that works. I mean, look at the graduation rates at schools. What was the one? Was it University of Nebraska Lincoln, where they weren't using any entrance tests, and the graduation rate was something like 14%. Uh, Almost nobody graduated because they all flunked out. They lost interest, whatever it was, because the people who came in weren't really prepared to do college work for whatever reason. Then you take it and you compare it to some school like Princeton or Yale or Chicago or any of the places like that, uh, where the raw material that comes in are extraordinary, and their graduation rates are 98%. And they only lose 2% because maybe they decided to transfer or do something. Uh, and that if those same students were enrolled at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, they would get a 98% graduation rate too. They would zip right through. And so it seems to me the place to spend money is at is earlier on, uh, prenatal care, early child care, preschool education. So that by the time the kids get to school, they've got a shot at it. And one of the things that we see, and you were the one who pointed this out to me, Dan, is that when you see group differences in, I don't know, 10th grade, you'd say, "Oh, look at that! We've got to do more work at ninth grade." But those same group differences were there in kindergarten. I mean, the reading tests that were given in first grade show these same group differences, and so they're there right at the beginning. And if you want to fix that, you have to spend the money before the beginning. Nobody wants to do this because this is expensive. Uh, Wait a minute, it's cheap to you know, fire teachers and put in a different teacher, but that's not going to do anything. It's expensive to have daycare, to have preschool, to have uh, prenatal counseling, and all the sorts of things that make sense to produce better, healthier children for the schools to operate on. But that's expensive, and I don't know. And it's not sexy. It's not like, well, we're attacking the schools by making schools better uh, by improving our children. But it seems like that's why is that such a terrible idea? I mean,
Howard,
against doing things to help the children.
I think that's going to be solved with all the money we're making off the tariffs now. So that one's already been solved. So I want to turn it over to students and let them ask a few questions. Amanda, your hand was up first.
Hi. You sort of already started putting on like talking about what I was going to mention, and it was with the funds and everything, because my high school students have a lot of questions about a lot of the legislation going on right now, and they talk about this like why we do it, and we've kind of had the discussion that instead of admitting that instead of spending $90 million on star testing, we could put that money elsewhere. They want to give these parents these easy fixes and say, oh, we're blaming it on the schools because phones, because of talking about feelings, because of all these other issues. And I was going to talk about a little bit where you have bad teachers are not disproportionately assigned to teach financially impoverished students, nor good teachers disproportionately assigned to teach non-impoverished students. And I really liked that part, and I wanted to talk about that. But you already mentioned like getting the money to prenatal care, to all that stuff. So you sort of kind of already touched on it a little bit, but that's where I was headed with it. So yeah, you already got there a little bit.
It's okay, Amanda. It's okay to have a question that was answered while I didn't see your hand up. So sorry about that.
Okay. It's
Uh,
okay. That's great.
Taylor, your hand was up next.
Okay, so you guys like touched on like answered a lot of the questions that I had already had. Um, Especially concerning like the wasted money on the curriculums. I know firsthand that we are given curriculum and we are told to use it and they pay for it beforehand. And if we do not use the curriculum, then we are then punished for it. Yet years later, when there are class action lawsuits proving that these curriculums are ineffective, then we have to shift and figure out where to put funding elsewhere. So my question to you was, do you see parallels between like the repeated reform efforts, air quotes, um, in other areas of public policy, like specifically, where social issues come into play, or you know, healthcare, policing, like ignoring those things for easy, quick fixes. Because from my perspective and how and the things that I've seen throughout the years of me teaching, I noticed that year after year, students are coming in with more disabilities or more health issues, more attention problems. There's more autism going around more than it was like really ever. And this is not just being seen because I've had my turn with public, private, and charter school sectors, and regardless to socioeconomic status or things of that nature, it's still I'm still seeing the same effects in children regardless, right? And then that has also, if we're talking about value added modeling, well, if my test scores are contingent on my student scores and the vast majority of my students are either undiagnosed or have some form of learning disability, then it's a setup for failure all around. So do you see or notice any parallels in that as well?
My goodness, I think so. If we look, there's just some recent work that I've seen. Uh, if we think about the licensing of physicians, just like the licensing of teachers, or the licensing of truck drivers or pilots, uh, what are the consequences of restricting licenses to some specific, to some high level? You've got to be good enough to be able to do that. And if you have these restrictions on that, who bears the price, the cost of that? And so what happens in licensing physicians you can get licensed as a physician. 95% of all the U.S. trained physicians pass the licensing exam the first time. So that's not much of an exam, except that it costs a lot of money. It costs $1,000 to take it, and 3 parts, $1,000 each. So it's a big deal. Each one takes a day. But 95% pass the first time. So you can imagine if 95% pass the first time, there's a huge range of ability among all the people who have passed. You got people who passed and are really, really special, and people who've just snuck by. And so what happens is they've studied to see how well patients do with doctors of varying ranges of performance. And my guess is that if you thought for 2 minutes, you could tell me what the result would be. But I'll tell you anyway. But and that is, for most patients, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. As the illness of the patient gets worse and worse, then the quality of the doctor matters more and more. So if you're really sick, you want a really good doctor. If you're just going in to have your feet checked, doesn't matter where you go. So the question is, how does that relate to what's going on in education? There we have a huge range of people who become teachers, some who have remarkable abilities and some who have less remarkable abilities. But the students who, the equivalent of being the sickest, the students who need you the most, don't get them. It just doesn't work that way. And there's lots of reasons for this. So I'm not sure how to fix that. The only issue is, how do you measure costs of things? What's the cost of having an incompetent physician or a less competent physician versus the costs of we're not getting enough physicians. We have to what do we do? So we get overloaded, or truck drivers, or there's a story that we tell in the book about, it was in the Montreal in a newspaper called the Gazette. It was the Montreal Gazette, and it was about a lifeguard, and the lifeguard was sitting in a chair in Montreal, overlooking the pool, and somebody got into trouble. So he yelled to a woman nearby to help the guy to the side of the pool, and she did. Then she came back to the lifeguard afterwards, and she said, "Why didn't you do it?" He said, "I can't swim." And she was aghast, and she said, "Can't. How'd you get a job as a lifeguard?" And he said, "I was bilingual." And you can say, well, that's funny. But in fact, the argument is different. The argument is lifeguards mostly don't have to go in, but they always have to speak. And so they had to make a decision as to what was more important. What was the cost of two kinds of errors? We have to. Now, of course, the answer is you want people who can swim who are bilingual. But you have to make, and so how do you when I worked at ETS, we had an exam for firefighters, and it was the exam that was used was the usual piece of crap ETS exam, and that for firefighting licenses that you had to do verbal analogies and reading comprehension and all the things that you remember. And so the ETS was taken to court, and quite properly they said this test isn't reasonable. Make another test. And so they made up a whole new test, and the new test had items on it like carry a hose up a ladder, carry somebody down a ladder, open something up and turn it on, and do a whole bunch of stuff like that, completely related to being a firefighter. Well, they took us back to court again, and they said because the test was biased against small people who couldn't carry a person down a ladder. And by small people, what they meant was mostly women. And the argument made was that you don't have to carry somebody down a ladder all that often, but you got to be, but to exclude a whole, half the population doesn't make any sense. And so you have to weigh the costs of these two different things, the cost of exclusion, and there are real costs to that. And then there are costs of, can you come over and help me? We got to carry this guy down the ladder and I can't do it. How do you make those decisions? And those are complicated decisions. And it's the law has a funny structure to it. Uh, Consider the following two situations, following two crimes. The first crime, a guy gets drunk and drives his car through a housing development, goes up on the curb and hits a 3-year-old on his tricycle on the sidewalk and kills him. What's the punishment for that? Well, that's pretty serious because the consequence of this crime uh, doesn't affect a lot of people, but the people it affects profoundly. Now think of a second crime. This guy goes into the Okefenokee swamp and finds the last snowy egret and shoots it, roasts it on the fire. And while he's roasting this last snowy egret that lived anywhere, he found the nest with the 2 eggs in it, the last 2 eggs of the last snowy egret, and made an omelet. What's the punishment for that crime? Well, there's a crime that affects a lot of people, but only this much. Now, the way our laws work is that the total effect may be greater in that second case than in the first case. But because it's spread so thin, the way our laws work is the punishment for that is minor in comparison to the punishment for the first crime. The same thing happens with other kinds of, when you look at what the costs are. If it's a small cost to a lot of people, it doesn't seem, like the costs associated with putting pollutants in the air. There is a cost, and then you add it to by 300 million. And the total cost may be gigantic, but to any one person, it's not much. And so the punishments for such a crime are, in our society, are much lower than the punishments associated with, with a crime that affects only one person. You go out there with an axe and hit him in the head, and I don't know how we get around that. And you can look deeply into yourself and you say, well, how do you measure that second kind of crime, the cost of that second kind of crime? How do you measure things that are more subtle? What's the cost of exclusion? I mean, that's a cost that is spread over a lot of people, and it's a real cost. But then the cost of, you can do all of that yourself. But I don't know how to answer these things. But I can see what the problem is. The answers are hard, and I can only see getting answers by getting people together, gathering data, and arguing. That's the way you work in a democracy: is you argue, and you say, I believe in stopping air pollution, and here's why, on and on and on. And here's data, and they say, well, it's going to cost this much money, and there you are, and you arrive at a solution when everybody gets to talk about it. The wrong way to do it is to keep it a secret, to hide the data, and not to allow anyone to talk about it. It seems the only answer is gathering data that will reflect on the problem at hand, and then making it public and arguing to see what happens with admissions policies at universities, how that affects graduation rates. Usually what happens if it affects graduation rates badly, you hide the graduation rate. I have one more story. This came to me from a friend of mine who's a professor at an elite place and has probably the best department in the world in this particular case. And at one point, they were forbidden to use the GRE in admissions for lots of reasons, and they were all perfectly good reasons. Just don't use it. So they soldiered on, and instead of using the GRE, they used, what college you went to, what your grades were, what courses you took, letters of recommendation, all those things, but no test scores. And so they admitted their class as best they could. Then they found that this class, after 2 years, when they had to take qualifying exams to be able to be admitted to write their dissertation, the failure rate on the qualifying exams increased by a factor of 4. They used to have a failure rate of 8%, and it went to 32%. Then that continued the following year. So I said to him, well, have they reconsidered using the GRE? And he said, well, no. What they're thinking of doing is getting rid of the qualifying exam. You know, I was bilingual. And it's a way of fighting obesity by getting rid of scales. You know, and you know, the only answer that Dan and I came up with in our book is gathering data and arguing in public with results. And the data may be embarrassing. It may be embarrassing to schools who, if their graduation rates fall, it may be embarrassing to all sorts of things. But that's the only answer. You have to gather the data that tells you how you're doing, and then make it public and argue.
Thanks, Howard. Are you okay with two more questions? We have two more.
Sure.
Okay, Mary, you were next.
Uh, I have a question because you were talking about resources, the allocation of resources, and I wanted to know, how do you see ed tech, which is $1 billion industry, and how it impacts the allocation of resources in schools, especially without sufficient unbiased research that's not being supported by these ed tech companies themselves. So I want to see your
Can you
view
tell me
on
more
that.
about specifically what ed tech you're talking about?
Oh, like the technology that is being sold in the school systems. There's a lot of technology that's out there that's very, very expensive, and I don't know how much is actually going into it, but it seems like it's a driving force where allocation, the resources, the financial resources are being spent on that type of stuff. And there's not sufficient evidence to say how it impacts.
Well, why do you buy something without evidence? It seems to me if I was at that school district and somebody's trying to sell me a widget that's gonna make everything better, I'd say, terrific. What we're gonna do is we're gonna randomly assign some proportion of our students, classes, whatever the unit is, to this widget, and the other, and randomly not. And then we'll see who does how. At the end of a period of time, who does better. So it goes back to what I said. First, gather data, and if it shows that it has a big effect, okay, and then you can decide whether that effect is worth the money. Uh, and you have to weigh it against other things. So, for example, if the cost of the widget uh, is about the same as cutting class sizes in half, then you have to measure, okay, would we rather have smaller classes or rather have the widget? But gather data, find out what the question is, gather data to establish the question, and decide what to do. When resources are short, you have to make those decisions. Certainly, that's the policy that's been followed in drug research, and big pharma is a very big deal, but they do clinical trials, and it makes things expensive, but at least you don't die. We know how well the drug works, and it's tested against alternatives. Try it, but just to say, "Whoa, that's cool. Here's $1 billion. Thanks. We'll try it." That doesn't make any sense at
But
all. You have
you've described exactly what every educational administrator does. And the solution you've described, I have seen no one, absolutely no one, not at K-12 or higher education, adopt a new policy and say, oh, by the way, it would seem incumbent upon us, if we're going to be spending 5 million or 50 million on this, that perhaps we should evaluate whether it actually makes a difference, does any good. Nobody does that, Howard. So again, getting back to our point of why do so many people in education do so many boneheaded things? I don't know. We have one more question. Corinne, would you like to go?
Hi, yes. I would like to go back to how you were saying that doctors who pass the tests, it doesn't matter the skill level, but the more sick that you get, the more skilled that you want the doctor. I want to relate that to teachers. How do we help distribute our abilities as teachers? At some schools I've been at, they prefer that you specialize as one subject or one grade, and you just stick it out. Or at another school that I've taught at, you are set to move every so many years at different grade levels. What would be more beneficial to distributing our abilities to make us better as teachers, but at the same time, hone in our skills to make us better for our students. If you have an opinion on that.
Or well, let me offer an observation. Uh, there's a story told about Pierre what is his name? Montreux. He was a famous conductor, and he was holding master classes uh, at Tanglewood. And young conductors were taking these classes. And one of the young conductors went up to Montreux and said to him that he was trying to understand the ineffable essence of Mozart. So Montreux said to him, he congratulated him on his high aim and said, that's a wonderful thing to do. But in the meantime, it wouldn't do you any harm to get the beat right. I think when we do teacher testing to try and see who goes into classrooms or do what, it's very hard to tell who's going to be a good teacher because it's very complicated. And what makes for a good teacher, we don't really know. But we should be able to get the beat right. And so I don't know if you'll be a good teacher of fractions, but I'd like to know if you know fractions. And so a lot of the tests are tests, should be tests, not of ineffable things that are hard to tell, but of facts. So I don't know if you're a good teacher, but I know you know math, and you're going to be a math teacher. So that's a good thing. I think the same thing is true in medical care. We don't know who's going to be a good doctor. The tests that we give just tell who's going to be a smart doctor. We don't know if a smart doctor is going to be a good doctor, but we're pretty sure that a dumb doctor is going to be bad. And so I think teaching, I think having teacher exams focused on the material that they're teaching to show real expertise, whether it's in grammar or if you're going to be teaching English or as Dan was talking about, if you're a bilingual teacher, you bloody well better be able to speak the two languages. And I know my wife left a storied career as a researcher to become a middle school math teacher and was shocked at how many other math teachers didn't know fractions. Because she saw these kids who couldn't do fractions. And the way they would do fractions is they would change the fraction to a decimal and then do whatever the operation was. And so she went to the teacher and said that the previous year's teacher and said, why are they doing it this way? How did you teach them? And she said, well, I never understood fractions. That's the only way I could do it. All right, now maybe she would be a great teacher, but not if she doesn't know it. I mean, so it goes back to, yeah, you can get the ineffable essence of being a teacher, but first it doesn't hurt to get the beat right. And I think that's going to be one way of improving the teacher profession. You don't know if they're all going to be great teachers, but at least they can keep the beat. You can keep the beat.
Thanks, Howard. I want to respect your time. And just before you go, I was just going to comment, I've known you now for 20, 25 years, and I'd say, you are one of the more knowledgeable folks in terms of having the content knowledge in your profession that I've seen. But another characteristic that teachers must have that's difficult to measure, but absolutely is essential for them to do their job, especially in the elementary grades and so on, is a quality that you've demonstrated, although it's difficult to test. And that is you've always been very generous with me in terms of helping me, especially early in my career when I was, to use a term I've used tonight, boneheaded, taking a tough time to figure things out, struggling along and things like that. You have that quality of jumping in and caring and helping other people, which I think if you put those two qualities together, sufficient background knowledge and content knowledge, plus a Mother Teresa type approach in terms of selflessness, caring, patience, and so on, we'd have ourselves some pretty damn good teachers out there, and you certainly exemplify that. So thank you so much for your time. Great to see you in person. Yeah, thanks for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for the kind words, Dan. Uh, I was just at a funeral memorial for a colleague, Bob Mislevy, and they talked more often than not about one of his characteristics, in that he didn't say anything. He was a Midwestern guy, and he never said anything bad about anybody. So if you went to him and you had a proposal for something, his response was usually something like, "Yeah, you could do it that way, but why don't we try this?" Uh, and the key phrase that I picked up from him, and I've used it a lot, is uh, is explaining something to him. He'd say, "I don't understand." Now, what that means, I've translated it. What it means is you're wrong. So I try to do that with other people. That I you know I'll keep not understanding it until somebody finally gets it right. And I appreciate being invited to see everybody. I can't tell you how much I hate doing Zoom things, because you can't find out whether anything's funny, because nobody can laugh by themselves. You only laugh when there are other people around you that are laughing. Uh, and so lecturing in this way is a great deal less fun than any other way I can think of. But it's better than not doing it all. I wish you well, and good luck with the rest of the course. Thank you very much, Dan, for inviting me. Bye
Thanks,
bye.
Howard. Have a great evening. Take care.